All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We are ready for another deep dive today.
Absolutely. Another deep dive.
So, as always, this is the show where, we take a big pile of information and try to sift through it, bring out the key
The
insights,
golden
the
nuggets?
golden nuggets,
Hmm.
yes, so that you can feel truly informed without having to do all that work yourself.
Exactly.
So, today we are diving into the fascinating world of William Butler Yeats,
Oh, yeah. One of the greats.
one of the greats. Um, and to do this, we have a wealth of material.
We do.
We have critical analyses of his work, biographical details, and even explorations of his deep involvement with the occult.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to move beyond, the simple labels that sometimes get attached to him and really try to understand the key shifts and concerns that shaped his remarkable and influential career.
Yeah, I think that's something that's really important. He had a really long artistic life, and there were a lot of forces that, influenced his poetry and his thought. I think it's really important to look at him as this dynamic figure who's constantly responding to his surroundings and reinventing himself and his art.
Right. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Let's start with early Yeats. One of the things that strikes me about his early work is how intertwined everything seems to be. You have Irish nationalism, right? This is serious interest in the occult, and then, of course, the ever-present theme of love. And it wasn't like these were separate compartments in his mind. They all seem to be feeding into each other.
Yeah, they're all very much connected. You can definitely see that. And I think a perfect example is the poetry you see in The Rose and then later in The Wind Among the Reeds. The rose, for example, becomes this incredibly rich symbol for him. It's not just beauty.
Hmm.
The rose can also represent the apocalypse, the woman he loves, Ireland itself. It can even represent this duality of peace and war.
So it sounds like he's using this image to, kind of encapsulate a lot of the things that are, swirling around in his mind and in Ireland at the time, which is, at the turn of the 20th century, which is also the fin de siècle, a period known for all this sort of artistic and cultural questioning.
Exactly. And a lot of fragmentation, a lot of contradictory forces.
Mm.
And you really see all that kind of coming together in his image of the rose.
Right. Yeah. And in To the Rose Upon the Root of Time, you can really feel him grappling with this desire to connect with something eternal, something transcendent, right? The rose being that symbol while also still being very rooted in the everyday, the common things that crave, as he puts it. It's like he's trying to bridge these two worlds.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how the poem itself really embodies that struggle.
Yeah.
The image of the rose really becomes a way for him to work through these tensions. And similarly, in another poem, To Ireland in the Coming Times, he actually directly addresses this potential conflict between his kind of mystical leanings and his nationalist beliefs. And he makes a case for how they can coexist, even though he knows some people are going to find them totally incompatible.
Hmm.
And I think it raises this really interesting question for us as readers about, how artists reconcile their very personal and often idiosyncratic visions with the expectations of, the public or maybe even their nation.
Right. And stylistically, I mean, these early poems, they have this really kind of dreamlike, ornate quality to them.
Yeah,
But one of our sources makes the point that, that shouldn't be mistaken for a lack of intellectual depth. There is real rigor underneath all that beautiful language.
absolutely. I mean, just look at his note on aid wishes for the clocks of heaven. He talks about how aid is a principle of mind, right? It's this kind of pure imaginative force. He's like fire burning by itself, or the myrrh and frankincense that the imagination offers continually before all that it loves. And so you really see his commitment to the power of imagination. And I think that's something he shares with earlier romantic thinkers, people like William Blake, who saw imagination as a gateway to a spiritual truth that you couldn't get to just through reason or logic.
Okay. And of course, he's not just writing poetry at this time. His involvement with the Irish literary theater is a really significant part of this early period. But, it wasn't always smooth sailing. I mean, plays like The Countess Kathleen, they definitely stirred up some controversy.
Yeah, that's where his artistic ideals sometimes really clashed with nationalist sentiments. I mean, he was trying to create this really, genuinely Irish theater, but a lot of people felt that his artistic choices, especially in that play, The Countess Kathleen, were, either misrepresenting Ireland or even just being straight up blasphemous.
So they thought he was maybe selling out Ireland in a way.
In a way.
Yeah.
But one interesting thing is that controversy, all that negative publicity, actually generated a lot of attention and buzz for the theater when it finally opened. So,
Sure.
Every cloud has a silver lining.
Right. And then we come to this kind of turning point in his personal life. This is around 1903. So Maud Gonne, who he's, proposed to many times over many years, finally marries somebody else, John McBride.
Right.
And shortly after that, Yeats embarks on his first American lecture tour. And our sources suggest that this leads to a real deliberate shift in his writing, a move towards what he called hardness, masculinity, and salt.
Yeah, it seems like it was a really pivotal moment for him. I mean, you have the personal disappointment, and then coupled with the experience of the Zector tour, it seems like he develops this new sense of artistic purpose. And he starts to experiment with, a different kind of poetic voice, one that's a little bit less overtly romantic than his earlier work.
So moving away from, some of those romantic poets that he had been influenced by earlier on, people like Shelley and Byron, who are known for their, intense emotion and idealism.
Exactly. It's not just style, though. It's also this change in the way he's engaging with the world, and I think that's really significant.
And it's interesting, even in these early days, he's already thinking about, the role of literature in relation to politics. He admired Shelley's argument in that famous work, A Defense of Poetry, where Shelley argues that, cultivating the imagination actually serves the nation and humanity in a much more profound way than just pushing, a particular political agenda. So it sounds like he's already trying to carve out a space for art that goes beyond just immediate political concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. He was definitely wrestling with that. I mean, his relationship with Victorianism, which is the dominant kind of cultural sensibility of the time, was very complex. And I think you can see him, both rejecting and engaging with, the intellectual inheritance of the 19th century. He criticized what he called the ethical and improving bent of Victorian literature. He felt they could sort of dilute the more essential truth-revealing power of art. But you can also see him kind of having this, what critic calls this covert dialogue with thinkers like Matthew Arnold, even though he disagreed with Arnold's famous idea that, art is a criticism of life. So, he's both pushing back against the 19th century and also kind of drawing from it.
Right, right. So as we move into his middle period, so we're talking around the 1910s now, it feels like real-world events start to have a much more direct influence on his poetry. He's kind of coming down from the ivory tower a little bit.
Absolutely. The ivory tower is cracking. You see it in poems like September 1913, which was directly inspired by this controversy surrounding the Lane pictures.
So what were the Lane pictures?
So the Lane pictures were this collection of impressionist art that this guy, Hugh Lane, wanted to leave to Dublin. But there were all these bureaucratic hurdles. And in the end, it ended up going to London. So it became this huge scandal and, symbol of kind of Irish failure to kind of embrace its own artistic heritage.
Right.
And in that poem, September 1913, you can really sense Yeats's anger and disillusionment. It's not just about the pictures themselves. It's about this feeling that Irish society is prioritizing petty concerns over artistic and cultural value. And so he's really moved, I think, beyond that kind of purely symbolic, dreamlike realm of his earlier work and is now grappling with very specific contemporary issues.
Right. So he's a little bit more grounded in reality now.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that, while he continues to write for the stage during this time, I mean, the period from 1913 to 1920 is noted for its, really significant dramatic output. But it's interesting that prose, particularly a vision, will later take on such a prominent role in his intellectual life.
Yeah, that's definitely a key development.
And then you also have this cluster of really significant personal events. So this is around 1916, 1917. Maud Gonne finally, for good, rejects his marriage proposal.
Right.
This is followed by a similar rejection from her daughter, Iseult.
Yeah.
And then very shortly after that, he marries Georgie Hyde-Lees.
Who everyone called George.
Right. Yeah. And this marriage to George really seems to mark this incredibly pivotal moment, doesn't it? Because her automatic writing, this really kind of unusual mystical practice, becomes the foundation for what he calls the system, which then, underpins his entire really strange work, a vision. It's described as a real collaboration. It's not just Yeats dictating ideas. It's very much rooted in this shared fascination that they have with the occult.
Yes, I think that's a really important point. And actually, what they call the automatic script is actually seen by some scholars as her own, creative contribution, and the entire system as this kind of joint project that they're working on together.
Wow. So this is almost like a spirit-guided collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this really intense exploration of the occult gives him this, new symbolic language and framework for understanding the world, which you can really see reflected in his later poetry and his thinking in general.
Right. And so we're coming out of this period where he's had this kind of heartbreak. He's married now, this new kind of, new direction in his life. And you start to see these longer poems, these non-isometric poems like The Tower and 1919. And for listeners who aren't familiar with that term, non-isometric, basically it just means the lines and stanzas, they don't follow this kind of strict uniform pattern.
Yeah, they have this more flexible conversational feel.
Right. And these poems, they feel like, these multifaceted responses to these incredibly complex historical and personal realities. I mean, the Irish Civil War is raging at this time, and you
Yeah.
really feel that turmoil, I think, in these poems.
Absolutely. I mean, the very structure of the poems, right? You see these shifts in tone, you see these different stanza forms. It all mirrors that complexity he's trying to grapple with. And even the specific stanza forms he chooses can carry this kind of symbolic or even what he might have considered magical meaning. Take, for example, the poem Blood in the Moon. He uses this really interesting embraced rhyme scheme. And this actually creates a sense of enclosure, of connection. And, some scholars have suggested that it actually reflects the way the poem itself tries to link the earthly and the celestial realms.
Right. And it's fascinating to think about the details of publications like the Qualla Press editions of, October Blast in the Tower, this deliberate emphasis on Irishness in every aspect, the typeface, the paper they're using, the colophon, the little symbol at the end of the book. It's like they're really trying to connect these books to Ireland and to his own personal sanctuary, Thor Ballylee, which was his Norman tower home.
Yeah, and it's all very deliberate. It's about
Yeah.
anchoring his work in a tangible Irish reality, right?
Yeah.
The book itself becomes an expression of Irish identity and craftsmanship, which also, directly reflects the Irish themes and settings of the poems that are contained within.
Okay, so now we're moving into his late period. And this is really where his, lifelong engagement with the occult kind of culminates in the writing and publication of A Vision. And this isn't just a fleeting interest, this becomes like a central organizing principle for his understanding of the world.
Yeah, a vision is really central to understanding the intellectual architecture of late Yeats. And, that entire system that he creates, which was born from those automatic writing sessions with George, it gives him this really elaborate symbolic framework for understanding history, personality types, the structure of the cosmos. But you have to remember, I mean, the nature of truth and reality in a vision, it's very complex and sometimes intentionally ambiguous.
Right.
I mean, it's blurring the lines between art and the realities that they represent. So it's a very difficult book to pin down.
Right, right. And this wasn't his first foray into the esoteric world, was it? He had earlier involvement with the Theosophical Society and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn.
Yeah.
And what was driving him there was this deep curiosity about what he called phenomena
Right.
and a desire, it seems, to tap into magical power.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and he even, entertained the idea of like a distinctively Celtic mystery religion.
So this was a really important part of his life. He wasn't just dabbling in this.
No, not at all. I mean, he saw magic not as, mere superstition, but as a potential key to unlocking deeper levels of reality, and connecting with this spiritual dimension beyond the material world.
Right, right. Okay, so we can't talk about late Yeats without addressing his later political views, which are undeniably controversial, particularly his, attraction to the blue shirts in the 1930s. This is a period that requires a lot of careful consideration, and, we should avoid, I think, simplistic interpretations.
Absolutely. I mean, while his association with the blue shirts is definitely troubling, it does seem like, based on the sources that we have, that his primary concerns were really about the establishment of public order, and he had this belief in the rule of, an educated elite.
Right.
So it doesn't seem like it was necessarily a full-fledged endorsement of European fascism. But, it's really important to understand the specific context of Irish politics at the time, which had its own, really unique kind of dynamics and anxieties going on.
Right. Okay. And then we also need to acknowledge, I think, the eugenic themes that surface in some of his final works. So, the posthumously published Under Ben Bulben and On the Boiler. These are, undeniably problematic aspects of his later thought. And, they've generated a really wide range of critical responses, understandably.
Absolutely. And I mean, even the fact that his literary executors decided to put Under Ben Bulben at the very end of Last Poems and Plays.
Yeah.
So it's transformed from this kind of more general introductory poem into his kind of final artistic testament. But even that decision, I mean, doesn't erase the fact that there are these, earlier passages in that poem that are really quite troubling and have these, clear kind of eugenic undertones.
Right. But ultimately, the poem concludes with this incredibly powerful image of his grave,
Yeah.
and the epitaph that he himself chose, which, has become so iconic, cast a cold eye on life, on death, horsemen pass by. It's a really powerful ending.
It is. It's a really strong self-definition.
Right.
Even in the midst of all this complexity and the contradictions of his later beliefs.
And it's interesting, his relationship with Irish folklore and legend also seems to undergo a kind of transformation in his late period,
Right.
right? He moves from this, deep conviction in its power, this
Mhm.
idea that it could fuel this national cultural revival to a more kind of abstract and symbolic use of it. And you can really see that in a poem like The Fisherman.
Yeah, absolutely. And The Fisherman is a really interesting poem, I think, in terms of marking this kind of shift in his thinking. Because it seems like he's acknowledging that his earlier, kind of idealizations of the Irish peasant, right,
Hmm.
as this kind of embodiment of folklore, were maybe, more of an artistic construct
Right.
than a reality. He calls it, dream. And so you see him starting to engage with folklore on this more symbolic level, right? Something that can still enrich his art, but in a less literal, more kind of internalized way.
Right, right. And it seems like, throughout his career, this question of audience was something that he was always negotiating.
Yeah.
Because clearly he desired a national audience.
Yes.
He wanted to be a voice for Ireland.
Right.
But he's also drawn to a more refined, more aristocratic, almost kind of exclusive form of art.
Yeah, I think he was always, navigating those two poles. He admired, for example, the poets of what was called the nation movement in the 19th century,
Yeah.
who were very much writing for this, mass audience.
Right.
But he was also, drawn to the idea of a more challenging kind of art, a more intellectually demanding art
Yeah.
that was really aimed at a discerning few. And I think he never fully resolved that tension, which in some ways is what makes him so interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so I want to delve a bit deeper into this concept of the mask and Yeats's thought. It emerges, really fully formed in relation to a vision. And it seems like this really central idea for understanding his ideas about, identity, creativity, and even how we present ourselves to the world.
Absolutely. So the mask, as Yeats understood it, is it's basically the image of the self that you consciously strive to become,
Yeah.
right? It's the ideal self that you're working towards. And it stands in contrast to your kind of everyday personality.
Mhm.
And, within the framework of a vision, it's in opposition to the will.
Okay, so the will being your kind of basic desires, your emotions.
Exactly, yeah. And the mask interacts with what he calls the creative mind, which is the realm of intellect and objective thought,
Okay.
and also the body of fate, which is the external circumstances that shape your life. And so what's important is that the mask is not about hiding who you are. It's about actively shaping and pursuing a desired identity.
Right. And then he makes this really interesting distinction between what he calls the true mask, which he often describes as, emotionally cold,
Right.
pure, and then, this more kind of messy emotional will. So there seems to be a real tension there.
Absolutely. I mean, the true mask, which is often associated with this, more intense, purified phase within his kind of cyclical system, it represents a kind of idealized perfection,
Right.
that the will, which is more, human and emotionally driven, is constantly striving toward, but
Right.
can never really fully attain. And of course, these four faculties, so the will, the mask, the creative mind, and the body of fate, they're all in this constant uh, cyclical movement,
Yeah,
on
right.
the great wheel, which is at the heart of a vision. And so they're always interacting and creating these, different configurations, these internal conflicts within the individual.
Right, right. Okay, so this kind of all ties into his lifelong aspiration for what he called unity of being, right? This kind of
Yeah.
harmonious integration of, the natural and the spiritual aspects of, of existence.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the mask was really a vital tool in his kind of personal and artistic quest for this wholeness.
Yeah, absolutely. It represents this deliberate attempt to kind of transcend the perceived limitations of the ordinary self,
Hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
and to achieve a more integrated and complete existence where the inner and outer worlds are more in alignment with one another.
Right. And one of the things that's so striking about his poetry is how much of it operates as this kind of internal dialogue, right? You have all these different voices, different perspectives clashing over these kind of core themes that he's exploring. And you really get a sense of him, wrestling with these ideas from multiple angles.
Yeah, that dialogic quality, I think, is really crucial to understanding his work because you see these internal debates playing out, these conflicting viewpoints playing out through the voices that he creates. And, famously, he employs these personae, right? Like, Crazy Jane,
Wow.
as this really powerful way to explore alternative perspectives,
Mhm.
to challenge social norms, to embody, viewpoints that might be considered unconventional or even transgressive.
And Crazy Jane is such a, vivid and enduring creation, this kind of, earthy, grounded figure who also possesses this, surprising, almost oracular wisdom
Right.
and often, turns social conventions completely on their head.
Right. And she embodies this, kind of subversive wisdom. She celebrates the body and desire, often in a way that directly contradicts more um, ascetic or puritanical viewpoints. And, she's also, I think, interesting because she's a kind of composite figure. She's drawing on a real woman that Yeats knew in Sligo, but also, archetypal figures from, English folklore.
Yeah.
And so you see him kind of fusing the personal and the mythic in this really, interesting way.
Right, right. And it's fascinating to see how, Yeats's work continued to resonate with later poets. James Merrill is a really interesting example because of his deep engagement with a vision
Yeah.
and also these, enduring themes of the mask and this pursuit of unity of being that we were just talking about.
Yeah, Merrill was very influenced by Yeats. I mean, he saw a vision not just as this kind of, eccentric occult text, but as almost like this epic poem written in prose,
Yeah.
this vast symbolic system that he could draw from for his own, poetic explorations. And so, in his poetry, you often see these echoes of, Yeats' concerns with the complexities of the self, the nature of the other, this, ongoing search for meaning that transcends the, purely material world. And the scholar, Kimon Fryer, actually played a really significant role in introducing Merrill to a deeper understanding of Yeats and also, the Gnostic and Neoplatonic traditions that, both of them found so compelling.
Right. And Merrill even wrote poems that seem to be directly, responding to or engaging in dialogue with Yeats's work.
Yeah.
I mean, a prime example is, Flying from Byzantium, which clearly echoes Yeats's very famous, Sailing to Byzantium. So it's almost like a conversation, across the generations.
Yeah, and Flying from Byzantium is a really, interesting example because it's not simply a, rejection of Yeats's poem. It's this really complex and nuanced engagement with a similar set of concerns. So he's kind of adopting these Yeatsian postures,
Right.
exploring themes of artifice, eternity, but ultimately, forging his own distinct artistic vision out of that dialogue. And if you look at, Merrill's own copies of Yeats's writings, he had all these really extensive annotations, in the margins, and it just reveals this really, intense engagement with Yeats's work. It's almost like a collaboration, even though, Yeats obviously, long gone by this point.
Right, right. Okay. Finally, I want to touch on the profound significance of place in Yeats' poetry. Specific locations, especially in his native Sligo and around his tower home, Thor Ballylee, seem to be imbued with these, deep layers of meaning and memory.
Yeah, I mean, place names in Yeats' poetry are never just these kind of neutral geographical markers. They're these incredibly powerful evocations of memory, history, and personal significance. And you see this, in poems like The Hosting of the Cid and The Stolen Child, which are so rooted in the landscape and folklore of Sligo. And, specific locations like Knocknarea or the waters of Loch Gill, they carry all this weight of association for Yeats.
Right. But there are also times when it seems like he might be prioritizing, the sound or the associative quality of a place name over its strict topographical accuracy, like maybe in The Man Who Dreamed of Fairyland. And,
Yeah.
it's almost like, the essence of the place matters more than its, precise location on a map.
That's a really interesting point. And it's true. I mean, while a lot of the places that are mentioned in that particular poem are, you can find them on a map of Sligo,
Yeah.
The way he uses them to create this, otherworldly realm that the man is dreaming of it's more symbolic and evocative than strictly literal. So he's using these familiar landmarks, but to really ground the experience of the supernatural, you
Yeah.
know, even if the topographical details are a little bit fluid.
Right, right. Okay. So what about the role of women and the exploration of gender in his work?
Yeah.
Because this is an area that's gotten a lot more attention, I think, from scholars in recent years, and it's moved beyond just, looking at the figures of his muses.
Absolutely. I mean, I think scholarship has moved beyond simply analyzing his portrayals of, individual women like Maud Gonne, and started to look more closely at how the very concepts of masculinity and femininity are, constructed and problematized within his work.
Mm.
And so, his friendships with assertive women and his tendency to, at times, kind of identify with feminine perspectives, these are all, really interesting aspects of his biography and his creative output,
Mhm.
and they're being explored now, more fully in relation to the broader social and political contexts of, his era. So, things like the women's emancipation movement, the complex dynamics of Irish decolonization.
Hmm.
Critics like, for example, Elizabeth Cullingford have done some really fascinating work looking at how, sexual politics influence the themes and tensions within, his love poetry.
Okay, so as we bring this deep dive to a close, I think, it's really clear that Yeats was this incredibly complex, constantly evolving figure. You know, he grappled with such a range of ideas and experiences over his long and productive life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from that early, passionate embrace of romantic nationalism and esoteric thought to, his more politically charged stances later on and his, lifelong intricate exploration of the occult, he's just full of contradictions and he's constantly reinventing himself, both artistically and intellectually.
Right. And to really understand him, it seems like you have to consider, this constant interplay between his very intensely personal life, the turbulent political and cultural landscape of Ireland during his lifetime, and then his really deep investment in esoteric and philosophical thought. You can't really separate any of those strands.
You can't. They're all intertwined. I mean, for Yeats, the pursuit of truth, however, elusive he believed it to be, it was always deeply intertwined with his artistic practice. He was trying to embody that truth in his poetry, even if he felt like it ultimately lay beyond the grasp of, pure intellectual understanding.
Right, right. So here's a final thought for you to kind of, chew on. We've talked about all these tensions and contradictions in his work. This kind of persistent push and pull between art and politics, between the ideal and the real, between, the spiritual and the earthly. How do these same tensions, how do they resonate with the challenges and complexities of our own time? What lessons can we learn, from his lifelong and often very turbulent search for meaning and order in a world that, was then, and I think still is, in this state of constant and sometimes unsettling flux? And, we really encourage you to delve further into the rich and endlessly rewarding world of William Butler Yeats' poetry and prose.
It's well worth the effort.
Yeah. All right. That's it for this deep dive.
Until next time.
Until next time.